Great. Well, thank you for coming. I'm going to present some work that I've done in collaboration with a couple of other graduate students in our department. It's great to be here, and I'm pleased to talk a little bit about this work. But I'm going to start by giving you a confession, and that is I'm not a mammologist. So I was hired as a quantitative ecologist in Colorado State University, and most of the students that work in my lab actually work on the conservation of amphibians and reptiles. So that's primarily what we work on, and in most cases we're looking at factors that influence change in population or change in the species distribution. And because that part is very general, I end up collaborating with a wide variety of people. So recently I've been involved in some work that involves disease, and I've also been involved in projects that relate to the conservation of native birds, fishes, and of course mammals. And so today I'm going to highlight some of that work on mammals that we've done collaboratively over the past 5 years. So I'm going to highlight 2 carnivore projects. The first is done in Colorado, and it's done by Jesse Lewis, who is a graduate student who's now gone on and will be a professor at Arizona State University starting in the fall. And he was interested in spatial and temporal interactions between some wild felids and how those interactions change with urbanization. And then we're going to change continents, and I'm going to talk a little bit about factors that influence tiger occurrence in northern India. And this work was done by a PhD student, Pranav Chichardia, who is now working for World Wildlife Fund in India. So I'm going to start with that first one. Jesse, and this work is published, Jesse was really interested in these interactions with wild felids, in part because he was interested in disease transmission among domestic and various wild felids of different status in the community of carnivores that exists in Colorado. So the carnivore community in Colorado is fairly rich. The dominant predators in that system are puma, of course, and black bear. And among these carnivores, some that are most likely to interact are these 2. So puma and bobcat, which is a smaller cat that we have. Lynx rufus is the genus species name. These 2 species tend to overlap in their habitat types and to some degree in their diets. Bobcat will actually scavenge on puma kills, and if caught, puma will kill bobcat. So there is the potential for some aggressive interactions if they come in close contact with one another. And what Jesse was interested in is these specific interactions and how they may change across the gradient of urbanization. So as you go from very wildland areas with low human densities to ex-urban areas where you can see sort of the houses dotted but on lower densities, to actually the wildland-urban interface. So this is the front range of the Rocky Mountains, and this is the city of Boulder. It's about 100,000 individuals now live in the city of Boulder. And as you move across this gradient, the potential for species to interact might change. So in the wildland areas, those species have plenty of area to move around in, and they can perhaps avoid one another. Where in the urban interface, they come up against a hard barrier, and that might influence their frequency or likelihood of interaction. And that was really what he was interested in. So he had 2 study areas in Colorado. One is on the western side of the state, so this WS, which is a less densely populated area, and then the other is on what they call the front range, the front side of the mountain. So you'll see that referred to as FR. And in both of those study areas, he established 2 grids. Okay, in the western study area, one of the grids was in this wildland area, and another grid that wasn't that far away was in this ex-urban area with a low-density housing. On the front range, or on the east side of the state, he again had a grid that was in the wildland area, and then he had a second grid that was right along this city of Boulder. Okay, Both grids consisted of 20 cells, and each of those cells was 2 by 2 kilometers in dimensions. In each of those, so 2 grids per study area, 20 cells per grid, and he placed a single camera in each of those grids in an area that he thought maximized the likelihood of detecting both of these carnivore species. And there he put a camera. And the duration of the studies varied slightly. On the western side of the state, he trapped for about 110 days from August to December of 2009. And then he switched and worked in the Front Range for about 90 days to October to December of 2010. And he used the detection information from these cameras to analyze the data. And throughout the 2 talks, I'm going to talk a little bit about occupancy models. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll say that what these models do, it allows us to account for the possibility that a species could use an area and you don't detect it, okay? And so we do repeated samplings in those areas, and in so doing, we can estimate 2 parameters, 2 types of parameters. One is called occupancy, which is the probability that a site, in this case, a camera location, is used by a species. And the other is detection probability, so it's the probability of detecting the species given that the area is used. Okay, and in some cases, like ours, you can interpret this as the frequency of use, and that's defined over a specific time period, and that's what I'm going to talk about in these 2 analyses. These models are fairly common. They're available in a lot of free programs like Mark and Presence and Unmarked, and you can fit various models which represent your hypothesis and rank those models using information criteria, as we used Aki's information criteria throughout. Okay, so Jesse used his data to look at interactions at 2 different temporal scales. The first one is this broad seasonal scale. Okay, he wanted to evaluate whether or not there was any evidence of interspecific interactions at the seasonal scale. Okay, so did the presence of puma influence bobcat occurrence at a local camera site and the likelihood or frequency of occurrence, in other words, the detection probability. Okay, so this is a broad scale look at the data. In this case, again, we define the site as the camera location. We're interested in the entire length of the study. And in this case, he just divided the entire length into 5 equally spaced occasions. So they're about 20 days each. Okay, so in this case, occupancy, like I said before, is the probability that camera location is used by either puma or by bobcat for that entire duration of the study. And detection probability is given that a species used the location. What's the likelihood that I detect it in basically a 20-day period? Okay, that's the interpretation of those 2 parameters. So going back here and exploring then whether or not puma's present influence bobcat, we need, we need to be able to estimate both the puma presence and the bobcat presence in each of their detection probabilities. So I need a little more complicated occupancy model. So he used a 2 species occupancy model. In this case, he's got 80 camera sites, right? Those are the total number of sites. Some proportion of those were used by puma. And so I'm going to use this A here to distinguish puma. So that's the probability that a camera site is used by puma. Some of them were not. Okay? If the site is used by puma, there's some probability that it was also used by bobcat. Okay, so I'm going to denote that with a big B. Okay? And if it's not used by bobcat, then it was only used by puma, right? At the sites that aren't used by puma, some of those are used by bobcat, and I differentiate that probability, and some are not. So some of the sites were not used by either of the 2 species. And really what I'm interested in is whether or not this probability is different from this one. And we would expect this probability to be higher. The likelihood that bobcat use a site might be higher if puma are absent than when they're present. Okay? But that's a pretty broad scale. That basically says, if that's true, that suggests that pumas have to exclude bobcat from an area for the entire duration of the study. So it's a very coarse metric. It could be that bobcat are only excluded from a shorter time period, like a 20-day period, for example. And I can express that in the form of detection probability. So notice I can basically say the site was in one of these 4 mutually exclusive states. Okay? And then given the state, there's a probability of detecting the species, whether it's puma or bobcat, in a 20-day period. Okay, so for example, if a site was only used by bobcat, there's some probability that I detect it in my 20-day period. There's some probability I don't. If only puma used the site, there's some probability of detecting it in a 20-day period, and some of them I don't. Okay? If both species used the site, there's some probability that I detect puma in a 20-day period, but I allow that probability to be different than on sites where only puma are present. And then finally, if puma are present and detected in a 20-day period, there's a probability that I also detect bobcat in that period or not. Okay, and it has a probability. If I didn't detect puma in that 20-day period, even though they both exist at this location, I can either detect bobcat or not. And so by comparing these probabilities, I can see if there's a shorter temporal interaction between the two species. Okay, so going back to the questions that he had. One was, do pumas spatially exclude bobcat? And if they do, these two parameters should not be equal. If they don't, they'll be approximately equal. The second question he had was, okay, if pumas use an area, then do bobcat use it with lower frequency? In other words, is the likelihood I detect a bobcat lower on a site that also has puma compared to sites that only are used by bobcat? And then finally, do bobcat temporally avoid areas that are used by pumas? So if pumas are also detected on a site, am I less likely to detect bobcat during the exact same 20-day period? So those are 3 different questions asking what is the spatial and temporal potential to interact. And then finally, he was also interested in whether or not the frequency of bobcat use was influenced by urbanization. That was really his interest, the grids, or by human development. So he had a covariate that looked at that. So those are the 4 primary questions, again, at this broad seasonal scale. So what did he find? There's no evidence that pumas spatially exclude bobcats for the entire duration of the study. Okay. There was, in fact, very high use or occurrence of bobcats in all areas, particularly in the western side of the state. So basically, bobcats occurred everywhere. They used every camera location on the western side of the state, and they were very common also on the Front Range, particularly in the wild area, a little bit lower so in that urban interface. And interestingly, pumas were also very common, particularly in the Front Range. Okay, they were basically detected on every camera location in that Front Range, in those Front Range grids. They're a little less common in the western side of the state. But essentially, these 2 species more or less use the entire landscape. Okay? And so they don't exclude one another. What about at the smaller temporal scale? So do pumas lower the frequency of bobcat use, and do bobcats temporarily avoid areas that are used at the same time by puma? And there's no evidence of that at this time scale. There was evidence, however, that the frequency of bobcat use was influenced by urbanization. Okay, so in more urbanized areas, the frequency of use or the detection probability is actually higher than it is on the wildland sites. Okay, so in terms of the conclusions with regard to this seasonal time frame, there was no evidence of spatial exclusion, but bobcat behavior was more influenced by urbanization than it was in human development than it was by puma presence. However, Jesse felt like perhaps the interactions were occurring on a finer time scale than what he could look at with this analysis. Okay? So he decided to redefine the time scale. He knew that scent marking is an important form of communication among all carnivores, particularly felids. So they have different ways of communicating via scat, or via markings or scrapings, or tracks themselves. Carnivores communicate this way, and in fact, felids spend a lot of time actually sensing and trying to determine where other species are. And he felt like that perhaps if an area was used by a puma, that bobcat might only avoid that area temporarily, maybe on the order of 1 to 4 days. That would be the maximum time period in which perhaps bobcat would avoid pumas if they had visited a site. So now he defines this sort of fine scale or daily interactions. And the questions then change slightly. So do bobcats temporarily avoid sites? They may both use the area, but they're going to temporarily avoid the site if it was used or visited by a puma. And if so, he was curious about how long they would avoid sites. Okay? What is the time period for which they might resume use of that area after a puma had passed? And is that time period influenced by urbanization? That was his most important question. And then finally, does the frequency of daily bobcat use decline with increased puma visitation? So here the only difference is he's defined the sample occasion differently. So now it's a day. Okay? So did I detect bobcat between noon on one day to noon on the other, which is basically the nocturnal and crepuscular time periods that bobcat would be active. And we're only focused now on a single species, that subordinate species, the bobcat. How does puma detection influence the detection of bobcat? Okay, so now my detection probability is just on a daily scale. And what he found was indeed bobcats do temporally avoid sites that are visited by pumas, but only in the wildland areas. So this is on the west slope, and you can see that bobcat detection daily is about 4% when pumas are not detected at the site. But if they are, then you're not going to detect bobcat at that site, even though they both used it for 1 to 3 days. And then bobcat will start to resume its use of those sites. They found similar things on the Front Range, though the lag was only 2 days, and then they started to resume. But again, this is only on the wildland area. Okay? When they don't have perhaps as much room to move around, bobcats don't temporally avoid pumas on these more urban impacted sites. So again, this is the western area. This is what I just showed you when puma are not detected. Here's my detection probability on a daily scale. Obviously, if they are detected in the wildland area, I'm not going to see them. Okay? But if you look at those in the exurban environment, there's either no difference or there's actually a slight positive effect. So basically no difference. They're not avoiding puma locations. Likewise, on the Front Range, this is what I showed you previously. Again, no detection of bobcat if I detected puma the day before, about a 5% chance if I didn't. And if you look at it on the wildland-urban interface, there's no difference. Okay? Bobcat are equally as likely to visit a site if puma had been detected in the previous day than if they had not. Okay. And in addition, then, he also found that across all grids, as the number of puma photos increased, the likelihood of, or the daily use by bobcats decreased. Now, his data only showed that about 10 was the maximum number of puma photos that he had on any given site over that 100-day duration. But he extended this further down to show you how much visitation perhaps would have to take place by the dominant predator in order to exclude completely that species at a local level. Okay. So his major conclusions then were that puma do not exclude bobcat on very broad spatial and temporal scales. They're using the same habitats. The frequency, though, of bobcat use does decrease as the visitation level of pumas increases, okay, as you might expect. And bobcat do respond behaviorally to avoid pumas at a very fine temporal scale, but these patterns vary across the organization. So this is only true in wild areas, and it's not true in urban areas. They don't avoid one another, which suggests then that urbanization may increase the opportunity of these interspecific interactions. Okay, and may increase the opportunity of aggressive interactions and maybe even intra-guild killing that could reduce the survival probability of bobcat. And importantly for him, it also increases the opportunity for disease transmission across those two felids. So that was another portion of his dissertation work. Okay, so I am actually going to switch here to the other project. And in this one, we're basically moving continents, as I said before, and we're going to look at factors that influence tiger occurrence at different spatial scales. And this was done by Pranab Chinchardi, which again was a graduate student in our department that now works for World Wildlife Fund. And this work was published a couple of years ago, and he worked in a landscape that had a variety of habitat heterogeneity. Okay, and he was really interested in how do tigers use what he called a working landscape. Okay, and so as most people probably know, tigers have declined tremendously over the last couple of centuries. This was the original distribution of tigers, in the dark orange is where they now exist. There's something less than 4,000 expected to be alive in the wild, with over half of those located in India. And his work is actually in a very less studied area up here along the Nepalese border. Of course, the reasons for tiger decline are well known. Most of them involve poaching. This is actually an animal that was on their study site and was poached just 5 hours before this picture was taken. Another graduate student that's currently working in the same area actually found the poachers and recovered this skin from them. But less publicized is the poaching that takes place on the prey. And prey populations have really been decimated in many areas of India as well as worldwide. And this alone has caused a number of declines in tiger population. There are other factors, of course, as well, and in his region, habitat loss and fragmentation basically takes two forms. There are forests in tiger habitat that are being plowed up and planted with cropland like the sugarcane, though there are other crops in the area. But it also comes with urbanization. So this is a very ancient town that is now of approximately 300,000, and it's built actually right in the middle of a tiger reserve. And so it has basically cut that tiger reserve into two parts. And this northern part of the tiger reserve now has very few tigers. They estimate only 2 occur now in that area, particularly because of this fragmentation caused by urbanization. But tiger conservation in India is actually quite controversial because historically it has involved establishing these protected areas and actually moving native communities outside of those protected areas. So by law, if human residents occur within national parks, they will be relocated outside of those parks. So these pastoral communities that might have just a small number of livestock that they're grazing within the park will be moved outside the park, and that's been extremely controversial, and a number of advocacy groups are sort of against this practice. So Pranav's work takes place, like I said, in northern India. I don't know if you can see this. This is India. This is where his study location is a place called the Tai. And that's right along the border with Nepal at the base of the Himalayas. And it's really, the name Tai really means swamp or undulated areas. And historically, this was very thick forest, very tall grasslands with lots of sort of fierce mammals and nasty snakes and full of malaria mosquitoes. And it's actually been attributed to the stop of the colonization into Nepal. So basically a lot of colonial troops died in the Thai historically and were not able to colonize Nepal. Now obviously this area has changed quite a bit in the last 200 years, and what this map shows is the same area, but the green here is forests, and you notice that the forests are quite fragmented. They appear in patches that are fairly isolated, also down here as well. The purple is supposed to be corridors, but those corridors have a great deal of human settlement within them and really don't function as corridors for tiger movement. So the point is that they occur in these patches of habitat. And Pranav worked in this study area, which is about 6,000 kilometers squared, and he sampled every one of the forest patches in this area. And importantly, these forest patches have different levels of protection. Some of them are those protected areas, and some of them are called multi-use forests, and that distinction is important. The protected areas, as I said, they were developed, these national parks are developed to protect tigers from poaching. So that's the big emphasis. There's a lot of ranger activity in here to keep poaching down. The livestock grazing and the fuel wood extraction is highly regulated and only in the buffers of these protected areas, and logging is strictly banned. If you compare that to the multi-use forests, actually they emphasize local harvest of logging. So the reason these forests exist is for the sustainable logging of wood from the area. And these are not large-scale mechanical logging. It's fairly traditional types of logging, but that's what these forests are for, is for that resource. Fuel wood and livestock grazing, there's few regulations on that in a multi-use forest, and there's not a lot of patrol or protection of tigers directly in a multi-use forest. But Pranav thought that these habitats were actually essential for the long-term conservation of tigers in the area. And so his study was sort of focused on that. So his overall goal was to assess the adequacy of the current protected areas. Are they enough, okay, for long-term, or do we need to take a more landscape level approach? And so his research objectives were really to identify those things that determined tiger occurrence at different coarse and fine spatial scales within this region. He was really interested in whether or not there's a difference in tiger occurrence between these protected areas in multi-use forests, or do they function more or less the same. In addition, he was interested in what is the human and livestock level, and does that influence tigers. Prey, of course, will be important. But he was also interested in vegetative structure, particularly this grassland community. That's certainly been shown to be important for prey, but he thought it was also as important for tigers themselves. And then, of course, landscape connectivity. So collectively, he has really two competing hypotheses, and they go back to how tiger conservation is done in India. One hypothesis say that protection is important. Okay? And in fact, the variation that we see in tiger occurrence in this landscape is directly the result of the differences in protection that is afforded tigers in the area. So protected areas prioritize wildlife. They have strong regulations on human presence. In fact, they exclude human presence in their core. And they create this space that's essential for tigers. So tigers are in protected areas, and they're much less likely outside of that. That's one hypothesis. And that's sort of the predominant hypothesis on which conservation decisions were made in India historically. A competing hypothesis basically says, no, the protected status of the area doesn't really matter. What matters is the distribution and density of prey. and the vegetative characteristics and how connected those habitats are. It's not on any status level. Okay, so tigers should occur where they have prey, not surprisingly, where they have cover and understory productivity, and they should occur where they can move around freely when there's connectiveness in the habitat. So those are the competing hypotheses. Okay, so what did he do? How did he sample the area and how did he analyze the data that he acquired? So as I said before, he sampled the entire area. He divided it up into blocks that are 166 square kilometers. There are 60 of those. And he sampled every one of those blocks, all of the potential habitat within them. So within a block, potential habitat consists of forest, which is the green, and grassland, which is the yellow. Okay, and within that, two independent groups of people walked trails within the cell, up to 40 kilometers of trail. Two independent groups, so they're not talking to one another. And they recorded tiger sign on each trail segment. So a trail segment in this case is 1 kilometer long. Okay? So that's how they sampled tigers. In addition, they collected a number of covariates, like the number of sign for the 7 primary prey species. They noted the number of humans and livestock seen, the presence of water, human dwellings, farmland, and grassland understory on each segment. And then they recorded how conducive the substrate is to holding tracks. Okay? And what is the intensity of vehicle and cattle use that might obscure wildlife sign. Okay? And to give you an idea of what the prey species actually looks like in this area, all of the species that you see in the top 2 rows are considered primary prey species for tiger, with the exception of this 4-horned antelope. So it's really these 7 prey species that he was focused on. These species can sometimes, a tiger can sometimes take them, but they're certainly not as big a food source as those other 7 species that you see. Okay. Now, in this particular case, because we're walking along basically a transect, okay, that happens to be a trail, it's more likely that a tiger would be detected or actually occur on a trail segment if the tiger had been on the previous trail segment, right? So we're interested in the occurrence of tigers at the large cell scale, that 166 square kilometers, but we're also interested in habitat use at this local 1 kilometer scale. But we allow for the fact that occurrence might be higher in an area that we know has previously been used, or in a fragment that had been used previously, because tigers are going to walk along. So the only difference in these 2 parameters is that the occurrence, the local occurrence of the tiger may be higher here than here because of the way that we sampled. That's all. So this accounts for the spatial autocorrelation in the sampling. And then we have detection probability. Given that they use this segment, what's the likelihood that I detected it? Okay. So he had a number of hypotheses that related to factors that influence tiger occurrence at the big scale. Okay, and these reflect his disturbance and his habitat hypothesis. Okay, the more protected area in theory, okay, the higher the likelihood that tigers are there. And he also felt like much of the poaching that was going on in that part of northern India was coming from Nepal. Okay, so if a cell was located near Nepal, okay, it was expected to have lower tiger occurrence than if it was located further from the border. Okay, and obviously, if you had a great deal of human and livestock activity, you would expect lower tiger occurrence. Here are all the habitat covariates that he thought positively influenced tigers, like prey, habitat area, grassland in particular, and this connectivity, which I've mentioned several times, but deserves a little bit more information. It's basically a categorical variable because we didn't have a lot of other information. He basically said if a cell is isolated from other patches, and even though this one doesn't look isolated, tigers really can't cross this boundary. So if a habitat patch, which consists of multiple cells, is isolated, he felt like tigers were unlikely there. Okay, low occurrence. If a cell was connected, but it was connected to different types of patches in Nepal, he thought that influenced occurrence. And the multi-use areas and the protected areas in Nepal are very different than those in India. In Nepal, protected areas are patrolled by the Nepalese military. Okay, so there's very little poaching in the protected areas, but that's not true in the multi-use forest. So if an area is connected to a multi-use forest in Nepal, then they're going to have lower, he thought, lower tiger occurrence than if a connected area is about a protected area in Nepal. Okay, so it's just 3 categories, and here are expectations for those categories. That's the connectivity part. Okay. If a cell then is occupied, he thought that local habitat use, the probability that tigers use this 1 kilometer, was also influenced by human presence, okay, or by habitat, positively by habitat that's in or around that kilometer. And then he had some hypothesis related to detection. So what did he find? What are the results? So here's a pug mark of a tiger, and right here is a bicycle track. So lots of potential interaction between the 2 species. He basically found that at the large scale, okay, the likelihood that tigers occur are related to prey and habitat connectivity. And then if they occur in the larger scale, then their likelihood of being locally present is also influenced by prey. It's influenced by the amount of grassland in the cell and the human livestock use. Okay? So showing those relationships graphically, tigers actually occur in a lot of places in this area. And in fact, his work has led to more protection and more understanding of this area in terms of tiger conservation. But basically, if you have a patch that's connected to a protected area in Nepal, all the cells are occupied by tiger. You guarantee occupancy by tiger. But if the patch isn't connected to a protected area, if it's isolated or a forest in Nepal that doesn't have the protection, then as prey abundance declines, you start to see tiger abundance drop. If prey is high, it doesn't matter, tigers will be there. But if prey abundance starts to decline, then you're going to start to see these differences in tiger occurrence. And that's not surprising. That relationship with prey is well known. Okay? Over a decade ago, Ulas Karan showed that there's a positive relationship between prey density and tiger density. That's not surprising. In fact, if you want to know what tigers are, you got to sample prey. But Pranov's work actually showed that not only are they important in terms of whether or not tigers occur, but how much of that habitat do they use? So as prey occurrence or the abundance of prey increases within the cell, higher and higher proportions of that cell are actually utilized by tigers. Okay, so it's that smaller scale relationship that he looked at. So prey is important at multiple scales. He also found that local use decreased as you had more and more people in the cell. So it wasn't important for whether or not tigers occurred in the cell, but what proportion of the habitat they actually use within the cell declines as you have more and more humans. Okay, so that relationship plays out at a finer scale. In addition, the grassland area is also important at the fine scale. As you have more grassland, the proportion of the area that is utilized also goes up. Okay? So what he thinks is that tigers actually may be resilient up to some threshold of human use, as long as that use is usually during daytime activities, if you have abundant prey. As long as you have abundant prey, tigers can tolerate some amount of human use. And in fact, grasslands may serve not only prey, but they may serve as a refugia, a daytime refugia for tigers. Okay? And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the gradient from grassland to forest here are two pictures. So here's the rich grassland habitat, lots and lots of prey. These grasses can get quite high, such that actually he had to sample them on the backs of elephants at certain times of the year because they're so tall. And the tigers are in there. Count on you if you're not on an elephant. But this is what some of the protected areas have become. Very tall canopy forest of sal that really is very unproductive for prey. Prey densities have fallen in these protected areas that have basically moved to this high successional state, and as a result, tigers are not as common here as they used to be in these protected areas. So, in conclusion, or his conclusions were such: tiger populations can persist in forests that are used by humans, even though, or simultaneous to populations in protected areas actually declining. Okay? And the protected designation doesn't really guarantee that tigers are going to be conserved there if you don't take care of the habitat and the prey species within it. Okay? So the protection itself is not sufficient alone. The fine-scale distribution of prey and the existence of these tall grass covers may enable high tiger occupancy and habitat use in areas, even though you may have a great deal of daytime human use in those same areas. So they may be able to tolerate some degree of human use. And then habitat connectivity, if you have it, basically guarantees that you'll have tigers, provided you also have abundant prey. Okay, so I'll end by thanking both Jesse and Pranav for sharing some of their slides and their research with me. This is Reka Warrior, who is also a graduate student. She's the one that actually found the poachers, and she's continuing to do some work in that area. I also want to thank my wonderful Brazilian hosts, Adriano, Ana, and Rodrigo, for being such kind hosts and tolerating the fact that I don't speak Portuguese, and everybody else in the labs that I've interacted with. It's been a very big pleasure. And then finally, I want to thank the funding agency that allowed me to make this exchange. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.